Far from being governed by the worst of men, as Burr had suggested, Monroe, like Gerald Ford in our time, was secure enough in himself to surround himself with advisors of more glittering talents and more transparent egos. For example, his appointment of John Quincy Adams as Secretary of State pleased Thomas Jefferson, who knew both men. In Jefferson's words, "They were made for each other. Adams has appointed Penn. Monroe has judgment enough for both, and firmness enough to have his judgment control." Like many men who have lusted for the presidency, once he was there, Monroe suffered at the hands of others who wanted his place while lacking his perspective. His amiability was famously put to the test when his Secretary of the Treasury, a man from Georgia named William Crawford, rudely challenged him over some federal patronage. A provoked Monroe raised his voice. A violent Crawford raised his cane, as if to strike the chief executive. "You damned infernal old scoundrel," cried Crawford. Seizing a pair of fireplace tongs in self-defense, Monroe ordered his Secretary of the Treasury out of the White House. So much for good feelings. We know about this extraordinary encounter because of John Quincy Adams, a front row observer who preserved the Monroe years in the pages of his famous diary. He cannot be said to have been an entirely impartial observer. To Adams, for example, the ambitious Secretary Crawford was, quote, "a worm preying upon the vitals of the administration." To their dismay, both Monroe and Adams would discover that a nation without parties was hardly a nation without factions. Monroe might be accorded near unanimity at the polls, but he could not repeal human nature. He was very much a hands-on chief executive, just as we've discovered in retrospect that Dwight Eisenhower, the famous hidden hand theory, was much more engaged in his administration than appeared at the time. Same thing with Monroe. Not a single significant appointment, even within his own department, said Adams, was made without the president's direct involvement. Adams might take credit in the pages of his diary for negotiating Spain's cession of Florida. But when the treaty hung in the balance, it was Monroe who took the lead in pressing Congress to approve the deal. And it was Monroe who used his influence to avert Congress from censuring Andrew Jackson after he invaded Spanish territory in 1818. In fact, Monroe himself drafted the diplomatic note to be sent to a protesting Spanish minister. Good reason for that. Monroe was a diplomat. He'd gone to France. He was Secretary of State. In fact, he was so skillful, during the War of 1812, Madison finally got rid of his incompetent Secretary of War, and he made Monroe both Secretary of State and Secretary of War. In a world still hostile toward popular government, Monroe earned respect for the United States by standing on ceremony. Even within the refined precincts of the White House, however, the old man was sometimes called on to play peacemaker. One evening over dinner, the British minister noted that every time he made a remark, the ambassador of France bit his thumb. "Do you bite your thumb at me, sir?" demanded the Englishman. "I do," shot back his Gallic counterpart. With that, the two diplomats put down their dinnerware and rushed out of the room. They were about to fight a duel with swords in the vestibule of the president's house when Monroe appeared, preventing bloodshed by ordering carriages for both of them. He also had, actually, a rarely glimpsed sense of humor. He had held more offices than any other man to be president. So he was thoroughly steeped in the byways and hypocrisies of Washington. Near the end of a lengthy White House reception, a friend asked the president if he felt tired. "Oh no," answered Monroe, "a little flattery will support a man through great fatigue." Well, he was flattered indeed in 1820. He won re-election to a second term. In fact, he received every electoral vote but one. No one's ever done it since. And that was withheld by a stubborn New Hampshire elector named William Plummer, who insisted on voting for John Quincy Adams, in part to advertise Adams' claims for 1824, but also to deny the last Virginia president the unanimous acclaim accorded the first. In modern parlance, Plummer might well have said to President Monroe, "I knew George Washington. George Washington was a friend of mine, and you're no George Washington. His second term would duplicate, however, the trials and anxieties experienced by the father of his country. Washington, after all, had been acclaimed by a nation that could agree on nothing else. Monroe's America was similarly divided as the issue of slavery thrust its way to the forefront of public debate. During his first term, remember, he had those 4 states that had come into the Union, 2 northern, 2 southern. He had presided over what we might call controlled growth, as new states knocked at the door of the Union with perfect symmetry. There was a reason for that. There was an uneasy balance, even then, over the issue of slavery. And since the House of Representatives, as you all know, was apportioned on the basis of population, the South increasingly took refuge in the Senate. And that's where every state had the same number of votes. And so as long as southern states came into the Union in perfect symmetry with northern states, then, well, you can do the math. Then came 1820, an intense acrimony over the proposed admission of Missouri as a slave state. Writing to Jefferson, who was retired at Monticello, Monroe said, "I have never known a question so menacing to the tranquility and even the continuance of our Union as the present one." Personally, he believed that one day an anti-slavery majority would control Congress, and indeed that slavery itself one day would be eliminated. But on his own watch, he was determined to pursue compromise. He saw himself as a man of the whole nation. That said, however reluctantly, it was James Monroe who sanctioned the first restrictions on slavery in America, the famous Missouri Compromise, which basically drew a line all the way to the Pacific and said slavery is not allowed north of this line. There was no shortage of other divisions to harry and perplex the old man in his second term. Henry Clay was the perpetually ambitious Speaker of the House who hated not only Monroe, but any president who was president, because that meant Henry Clay couldn't be president. He dismissed the president as a political irrelevancy. The old president finds himself woefully beset, deserted by all his old friends, obligated to seek new ones. Well, actually, the old president retained a very youthful ardor for the cause of human liberty, especially in his own hemisphere. Monroe is not a charismatic figure. He's not a colorful figure. He's not a quotable figure. There's not a lot of things about Monroe that have lodged in the national consciousness. One thing, however, is, and that is the Monroe Doctrine. And it is the Monroe Doctrine. Adams drew it up, there's no doubt about it, but it's Monroe who insisted that it happen. In fact, Adams tried to restrain the president. He thought he was abandoning George Washington's traditional policy of isolation from the rest of the world, giving the United States enough time to build up its economy and its military to withstand aggression from any other power. It was Monroe who denounced Bourbon France for trying to suppress liberty in Spain. Monroe who pronounced an anathema on Turkey for denying Greek independence. Left to his own devices, Monroe would express solidarity with the hard-pressed Greeks by sending an American minister to Athens. Well, Adams said that was going too far, that such language would take his own country by surprise. He said, like a clap of thunder in the night. Why take sides in the quarrels of Europeans, Greek against Turk, Turk against Russian, France against Spain, the Balkans against the world? If we must come to an issue with Europe, said Adams, let us keep it off as long as possible. Well, Adams would tell the Europeans to conduct their own quarrels in their own backyards. Monroe would take it a step further and tell them to leave the Americas unmolested and uncolonized. Remember, South America at this point, Spanish, and what was beginning to happen were colonies, Spanish colonies were beginning to declare their own independence, following in the footsteps of the great Yankee Republic to the north. And this, by and large, is exactly what Monroe proclaimed in his annual message to Congress in December 1823. It had no force at all behind it. The only force behind the Monroe Doctrine was moral force, the superior claims of republicanism with a small r against monarchy, the sovereignty of a free people against the dominion of royal blood and noble pretense.